Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. The bells indicate we have votes in 15 minutes, so we're kind of in overtime, and I'm going to ask Mr. King and Ms. Chu, who've been good enough to be here, to limit their answers and questions to 4 minutes and ask the respondents to answer quickly.
Reserving my right to object, Mr. Chairman, I'd point out that nearly everyone on this panel ran over the 5 minutes, and so I have some important things I want to raise, and I'll try to respect the time. But and I'll just make this point. As I sit here and listen to this go back and forth and back and forth, and there will never be an end to the discussion and the argument, because where you sit is where you stand. So you'll always try to draw a little advantage for whether it's for Maine or Utah or whatever it might be, because you see it through that lens. And there's a certain characteristic of human nature that I have noticed in my times of business and public life, and that is that if you appoint a committee, that's the first thing that sets the conclusion that the committee will draw. The second thing is you assign a charge to that committee, a mission, and they will start down that path, limited within the definition of that mission. Then you appoint or elect a chair, and that chair will then have an agenda, and if it's a powerful chair, and usually it is, the members on the committee will line up behind the agenda of the chair, and then they will just seek to perfect that path or that track that has been laid out by the committee, the appointment to the committee, the mission for the committee, and by the chair of the committee. And so as I listen to this, it occurs to me that we've been dealing with something here at the federal income tax and the state income tax, that next year we'll celebrate the 150th year of the first income tax in America. That was by the Confederate States of America in 1861, it lasted 10 years. Then in 1894 we had a federal income tax that lasted for a year. It was determined to be unconstitutional. And then the Congress just 100 years ago last year passed the constitutional amendment, the 16th Amendment, and it took a few more years, 4 years, to ratify that. So soon we'll have a century of the income tax. And I'm hearing that what we have is archaic, physical presence is archaic because the world has moved on, yet we're cobbling together how it is we're going to bolt new parts onto a more than centuries old income tax system that was federal and most of the states have adopted on, and each one has a different set of rules. And so I'm going to submit that this committee has gotten more and more tunnel vision over the years. And we've not stepped back and looked at this from 10,000 feet. And we haven't decided how we're going to adapt a tax policy for the United States of America that's right for the 21st century and maybe lays the groundwork for adaptation into the 22nd century. And I'm going to say for the 21st century, the IRS itself has to go. It is a cobbled mess that no one understands, and it creates the convolution of the state's income taxes as well. And setting aside the federal problems that we have, even if we do the things that have been advocated here and by each of you in certain ways, and Mr. Johnson most recently, we're still going to end up with 50 different models, as clean as it might be, to go see what the state's policy is. I'm going to suggest, why don't we do one model for the United States of America? Why don't we allow the states within the 10th Amendment to conform in a fashion that will allow us to have an opportunity for a single model that would be conducive to business in all the states and completely simplify this. The streamlined sales tax, which I have done some work on as a state legislator, and I am not quite to the point of despair, but it's very difficult to get to the point to get enough states to agree. I believe if we go to a national sales tax, the states will follow, probably all of them eventually. And the streamlined sales tax can be a tax, a low tax, on all sales and service, regardless, so when we don't have to have the discussion about what is taxed and what is not. Everything, last stop retail, sales and service. If we do that, we eliminate everybody's problem here. We can solve the federal problem of this convoluted mess. Another point that I would make, and it would be in disagreement with Mr. Crosby's statement that, that businesses would still be paying taxes. I've never believed that businesses pay taxes. They pass them along to their customers. Taxes are really assessed at the retail level, sales and service. And so this simplification that I'm proposing solves every problem here, and it creates a dynamic economy at the states and in the federal government, and it moves us into the 21st century in a way that we've got a model to work on, rather than this model that's had parts bolted on it and been upgraded and convoluted for 150 years. And if there's anybody on the panel that'd like to tell me how much you've thought about that I've just described here today and speak to that, I'd be very interested in hearing it. Mr. Johnson.
I think at the FDA, we believe that the state sovereignty is core. The ability to raise your revenues and determine how those tax revenues are shared by the people of the state is an important part of the legislative process, and we think that's what the Constitution envisioned. It's not pretty.
And Mr. Johnson, I agree with you in the 10th Amendment principles. I'm going to suggest the states would opt in if the federal government would go to a national sales tax, because they would see how it's streamlined in that fashion. At this point, I think I just conclude and appreciate the witness's testimony, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Chu, thank you. You're recognized.
Well, I know we're under time pressure, so I'd be happy with a very succinct answer. But I am really happy to see Congress step in and for us to be pursuing this line of reasoning, because of my previous position. Prior to this, I was elected to the California State Board of Equalization, which collected the sales tax for the state. And overall, we collected $53 billion worth for the state of California. And we watched as there was a decline in sales tax revenue as there were more sales online, and the bricks and mortar companies were suffering, which forced California to rely more on income tax for its state revenue rather than sales tax, which resulted in a much more volatile revenue stream for the state of California. And so we have these hodgepodge of laws, and the latest example is Expedia, which negotiated rates with hotels, of course, charging ultimately charging a lower wholesale room rate than what an individual could get on their own, and but then only paying local taxes on the wholesale rate rather than the rate that they charged customers. And the city of Columbus, Georgia, sued Expedia for this practice, saying that the city had a right to that which was charged the customer. Well, Expedia argued that they didn't have to because they didn't have a physical presence, but it went to the Georgia Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that Expedia did have to pay pay the higher rate, the rate that they were charging the customers. And recently there was a case in California where a California city is suing Expedia also for the hotel tax that they charge every hotel in the city. So my question is, why should there be a standard definition across the states? What is the fairest way to create these standards? And on the Nexus issue, should there be separate legislation for each situation, sales tax versus income tax?
Is that?
And for anybody, yeah.
Well, first, I mean, there are a lot of questions there. I think, first of all, it's my view, as I stated in my testimony, that I think that certainly with regard to sales tax, which is probably the biggest issue than the one you address, I believe very strongly that Congress needs to take a very hard look at whether the physical presence standard really makes any sense. I mean, is that a good proxy for an ability to comply with the sales tax? And if it doesn't, there may well be another standard, and another standard that is really much simpler. Anybody that says the physical presence standard is clear has not read hundreds of pages of my treatise, hundreds of pages of case after case after case, which has a different definition of what constitutes a sufficient physical presence to create Nexus. A simple rule that said 10,000, 100,000, a million, you pick the figure, I think would be certainly simpler. And that's a question Congress needs to ask. I think the Expedia question is another very important question, but unfortunately for the moment one very much mired in local accommodations taxes. I would agree with you that it would be nice to have a uniform rule that taxed on a uniform basis if the states decide to tax. Right now the problem really is that these are not statewide taxes. They are local accommodations taxes, and the real question is whether under one of those taxes is Expedia an innkeeper. And so it's a technical problem. Congress might well want to intervene in that area, but again, it would clean up a lot of the subnational and even below the state level, clean up a lot of the uncertainty. But again, there's the question of how far does the Congress want to intrude into what has historically been clearly a matter for local determination.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. I appreciate it, and I thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. It's a tie for witness of the day. We had 3 great witnesses. Without objection, the members will have 5 legislative days to submit any additional written questions, which we forward to the witnesses, and ask your answer as promptly as you can. They'll be part of the record. Without objection, the record will remain open for 5 legislative days for the submission of any other additional materials from members of the committee or from witnesses, I guess. Again, I thank everyone for their time and patience. This hearing of the subcommittee is adjourned.
I